Machado é jornalista, historiador, escritor de mais de 30 livros, entre eles o Balas de Washington e o Estrela Vermelha sobre o Terceiro Mundo, ambos publicados aqui no Brasil pela Expressão Popular. Ele também é editor na Leftward Books e diretor do Instituto Tricontinental, que tem sedes no Brasil, Argentina, Índia e África do Sul, e, claro, para estar aqui com a gente, é comunista. Welcome, Vijay, and thanks once again for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Listen, firstly, you have a great name for your project.
Thanks.
I mean, Media Ninja. Wow. You know, I have a fascination with martial arts. So that's amazing. I wrote a book called Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting
Yeah.
in about 20 years ago. So there's that. Plus, it's a legendary project. Amazing. Amazing. What a great
Thank
name.
you.
I mean,
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
You know, Media Ninja appeared during the protests in 2013, and it was really like guerrilla journalism, and that's why it got the name Media Ninja. Let me ask you one thing, since you cited Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting, why did you name your books after songs, you know, like Carl Douglas, Kung Fu Fighting, and now The Clash, Washington Bullets?
So firstly, I don't believe that books are measured by anything other than their titles and their covers. I think human beings, as a consequence of capitalist, the flat spectral aspect of capitalism, how things appear to you is important. After all, Marx writes in Capital that the world appears to you as an immense abundance of commodities. So appearances matter. You can't just say no, it's the content, it's not the form and so on, or even the appearance. I don't agree. I think appearances count a lot. And we on the left, I think we generally, or at least the tradition we come from, just doesn't pay attention to that. We don't pay attention to aesthetics, to to image, to the surface level. And so for years I thought every time I'm going to make a book, I'm going to think really hard about the title. I want the title to both capture the argument and be evocative in a way. It should be pleasant. I very much like painting, for instance. I think paintings are a way of entering the soul of people. It goes beyond argumentation. It hits you in the other parts of your body. So Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting was my third book. The second was called The Karma of Brown Folk, which evokes the title of a book by W.E.B. Du Bois, the very, very important black Marxist from the United States. Du Bois is, in a sense, the founder of U.S. sociology, because he wrote a book called The Philadelphia Negro, very important book. He's the founder of a kind of interdisciplinary writing with souls of black folk. In a way, he's the founder of US history writing in the modern sense, with his immense book called Black Reconstruction. Incredible book. So that was the second title. The Souls of Black Folk became The Karma of Brown Folk. Then who doesn't like well, let's put it plainly, the very bad songs and movies of the 1970s? I adore Bruce Lee movies. I adore them. And the last chapter of that book is about Bruce Lee as a film genre of anti-US war in Vietnam. Because when you watch Bruce Lee movies, Enter the Dragon, Return of the Dragon, the critique of US imperialism is quite clear. And so anyway, Carl Douglas. And the song is interesting because it's written by an African American, or rather performed by an African American. It's written by a Pakistani woman from the UK and an Indian producer by the name of Biddu. Actually, maybe it's not written by a Pakistani woman. It's done by Biddu, who's an Indian producer. And the book is about Afro-Asian affiliations and alliances. So I thought, well, here's a case of an Indian producer, an African American singer, and the song is about martial arts. Everybody was Kung Fu Fighting. I love The Clash. My favorite music is punk and post-punk music of the 70s and 80s. I adore Stiff Little Fingers and those bands. And unfortunately, I only play the acoustic guitar. I don't play an electric guitar. You can't really make noise with an acoustic guitar like you can with an electric guitar. But when I first heard Washington Bullets, God, so long ago. It's in the album Sandinista, which is a terrific album, an homage to the Sandinistas and their war against U.S. imperialism. When I first heard that song, I thought this is the best line, Washington Bullets. And it's the tagline in the song, right? They warn about Washington Bullets, and it starts with Allende and with Victor Hara, and they've got these little Spanish bits, es verdad, and so on. And then I thought, I'm going to use it someday. When Evo Morales was overthrown in the coup in November 2019, I said, now I'm going to write that book. And guess what, pal? That's the title. That's the title. Because people don't believe that Washington fires bullets anymore. They don't. They've been misled into the belief there's no US imperialism. And I was like, that's the title. Before it's too late, gotta take that title. Unfortunately, Strummer is dead. Unfortunately. Otherwise, I would have sent him a copy of the book.
So talking about Washington Bullets, while reading the book, Vijay, I felt like I was reading like a beautifully written manifesto, and I've read the possible history of the global South and the poorer nations, but Washington Bullets strikes me as a different kind of book. I feel you're a bit angrier, and it seems more speedy in the writing, though beautifully written. And I'd like to ask you what drove you to write that book. I know about the coup in Bolivia, but also what drove you to write this book and release it so fast, because it came out just months after the coup, right? And what audience did you have in mind when writing that book?
There's a lot to say there, and thanks for that, because that's a really precise question, because there is a shift in both form and audience. And I want to say something personally, but I'm also saying something to writers, which is that give yourself time to mature. It's taken me a long time to learn to write in the way I now want to write. Many years ago, when I was a young journalist, I happened to run into Galeano. And the first time I ran into Galeano, I hadn't planned it. I was in a place and there was Eduardo Galeano, and I almost died. There are two writers that I admire more than life itself. One was Kapuczynski. Um, Kapuczynski was this great Polish journalist who was the Polish agency's foreign correspondent. And his writings is what made me want to become a journalist, because reading Kapuczynski, landing in Delhi in the middle of the night, spoke only Polish, didn't speak really English, didn't speak any Indian language. I mean, and then just was able to understand things. Reading his book about Ethiopia, reading his book about Iran, very inspired. But Galeano is like the prince of writers, descended from the heaven of writing, and came up with, not words, but honey. It's honey on a page, and I was lucky. I got to know him a little bit. And then I asked him one day, how is it you write so beautifully about such horrible things? And I said, that's what strikes me the most, particularly days and nights. I don't know what the title is in Spanish or in Portuguese, but it's the book about political violence in South America, about the torture and so on. And, he writes that line in there that South America's great comparative advantage is we are the world leaders in torture. And we've, and so on. It's a cruel line. It's a cruel line. And he's thinking about the military coup in Brazil in 64. He's thinking about the 1970s coup in the Southern Cone and so on. And his answer was very straightforward. He was like, look, torture itself is torturous, and is terrible. Why would you want to replicate that in the page? You want to have in it something other than that. So, why did I say it takes time for a writer? As a younger person, I read a lot, I researched a lot, and I have always been interested in summarizing the work in the academy. So, if you read the Darker Nations, which will come out in Portuguese this year, when you read the Darker Nations, there's some original research, some chapters. The chapter on Belgium, on the League Against Imperialism meeting. There's some original research on the chapter on the non-aligned meeting in Belgrade in 1961, 60 years ago this year. There's some original research on Singapore. I went to the archive and read things, but a lot of it is reading or vacuuming an enormous amount of literature, secondary literature, and trying to shape it. Because I feel like, and I felt this for a long time, that there's something undemocratic about the way academic work is presented. So, academic work is difficult. People spend a lot of time reading literature, vast amounts of literature, doing research. And then, like in any guild, right? A language is constructed for the guild. It's fine. I don't have a problem with that. And the guild then develops knowledge. But just like the guild of magicians, somebody has to steal the magic and go to the people and say, look at what I can do. I can make things disappear. And that magician that goes to the fair to entertain people is different from the druid, the magician who's in the forest, where they create potions and then they come out and they don't tell you what they're doing. So those magicians in the forest, the druids, that's the academics. And I felt I want to be the clown that steals some of that stuff and goes to the fair and says, look at this, look at if I throw this in the air, it becomes green, and so on. And that's what I did with Darker Nations. It's a lot of academic work, very good work, reshaped a little bit and cast for a larger audience. Now, over time, I've come to realize that there is a discourse that exists, there is a cliche that exists, and maybe it's true, that young people, even young militants, young activists, militants, whatever word one uses, fighters for justice, etc., they say they don't read. There's a statement made, they don't read. And statement made, well, it's all, social media and so on. I don't like that attitude. I feel like we have to think differently. It's not that people don't read, it's how might they read. So I thought, then let's create a form of text that people might read. And so what I've tried to do in the Red Star Over the Third World, that was really the first attempt at this. Washington was second. How can we write a text with very short chapters, with punchy language, shorter sentences, vivid descriptions, so that somebody who's used to Instagram, who's used to TikTok videos, can devour text? Because if a chapter is going to take you 3 hours to read, or 2 hours to read, or even an hour, you lose interest. So can I break up a book into short sections where each section is like a TikTok video and then you just scroll? So the form of Washington Bullets essentially is an analogy to social media consumption. You read one section and scroll, and then you can put the book down and say, wow, that was interesting, and come back, open it, read it, and scroll, and maybe scroll again. And it's okay actually if you just scroll 2-3 and go ahead. How do you construct a text where if you've missed one of the pictures, you still get the thread? So I've been thinking a lot about bringing the form of social media into the text world that we produce, because I believe you can't just create a set of videos on what I wrote in Washington. You need to have the text there. You need some evidence. You need something there that's longer. But I want to derive something from what social media has done to our mode of seeing, our way of seeing, has to be, I think, translated. So I said it takes time. You've got to really let yourself, I'm using the word mature, but I don't mean mature in terms of personality. I mean as a writer. And so I feel like now I'm at a place where I'm able to experiment with form and content, because I don't feel like I have anything to prove. When I was younger, and I wrote my first book, I needed to prove something to other people. Like, look, I can say something, damn it. I mean, I'm also intelligent. I'm not that foolish kid who used to get high all the time and play, Steely Dan songs, and pretend that I was a cool guy or whatever, I'm not that guy anymore that needs to prove something, I remember that guy. I love that guy. I have no problem with him. I love people, young people now, who also want to say, look, I'm also serious. I understand that it's a real feeling you have, you have to embrace it. It's fine. But after a while, you say, look, I just don't need to prove because now I want to experiment and I want to take risks and I want to see if we can do interesting things. Now, there'll be failures. I've written a lot of books. Many of them have been total failures in terms of form and content. I'm disappointed with them. But you learn, right? If you don't fail, you don't learn. This people have a saying: if you don't try, you don't succeed. Right? People say, if you don't try, you don't succeed. I hate that. I hate that phrase because it's too much pressure. My pressure is, if you don't fail, you don't learn. If you don't fail, you don't learn. So I failed a lot and I'm learning. Now, I like Washington Bullets. I think I was very happy with it. But I know there's some problems still. And the next time I do a project, I hope I can at least tackle some of them. Unfortunately, the next project cannot be experimental, because the next real project I'm doing is the selected writings of Ho Chi Minh, writings and speeches. I can't really experiment with him because he's like a, he's like a Titanic Olympic god, so.
Still talking about Washington Bullets, you list U.S. endorsement for coups and assassinations, and leaves no doubt to the role the United States has played in overturning democracy around the world. And yet, the champion of the free world ideology seems to somehow endure. How come?
Well, one of the features, actually, this goes back to, I guess, the earliest wars, right? Wars are not just when you run with clubs and hit each other or come with spears or whatever. A war also has an aspect of information war. It always has an aspect of economic war. Even in medieval times, you'd go and surround a city and you'd prevent them from eating, you'd starve them. That's a form of economic warfare. It's a medieval siege. That's what the US is doing to Venezuela and to Cuba and so on. It's doing like they're surrounding, the army surrounds the city, and doesn't allow you to trade and so on. It's like a siege. So war has always had many forms. We've forgotten that, over time. I think as a general practice, we've forgotten that. We generally think of war as the fighting war, and we forget the aspect of information war and so on. You haven't forgotten it. That's why you're media ninja, because you obviously understand that you need to be ready and supple. I don't think you all wear black and go out there and assassinate people, but you have that in your name. There is a sense of us being part of the battle of ideas, of an information war and so on. But part of that information war, particularly after World War II, part of that information war was to cast the Soviet bloc as unfreedom and to cast the West as freedom. And they did it really successfully. They used the word free as an adjective to describe everything they did, which is the opposite of these societies. But I'll tell you what I mean by opposite of these societies. They said, for instance, we are Radio Free Europe. The word free is there. Radio Free Asia, Freedom Foundation, Liberty Foundation, Heritage, Liberty, Freedom. This woman, forgotten her name, who won the election in Spain, the mayor's election. What's her name? Never mind. She ran on a slogan, communism or liberty. You see, it's the old Cold War slogan, communism or liberty. And they kept hammering that over and over again, saying, look at them, they are not free. The problem is, once they defined the terms, then the left had to, from a position of defensiveness, say, no, 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 you are not free. You are not free. What are you saying? You are not free. Look, you have racism there, you have this, but you are now accepting their terms. You see, by now starting to say, no, 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 actually, you are not free. You are the unfree world. You're accepting their division, and then you're finished. Then in people's minds, it's now clarified that the West is free, the rest of the world is unfree, and even the critics of that binary use the same binary. No, no, you are the one who's not free, but you're accepting the terms of division. And that's wrong, because after all, nothing is really free in your societies. You have to buy everything with money. Why don't we have a different division rather than free and unfree? We accept it and you lose then, right? It's a trap. You enter that trap. So very sophisticated way in which they say, look, you can do anything you want in our society. You can if you have money. The issue in the West isn't that they necessarily jail you for your ideas. They may not. They don't actually jail you for your ideas, because you are irrelevant. You don't have money. I mean, look, they can get you. Like Mumia Abu Jamal was not arrested for his ideas. They accuse him of killing a police officer, and they hold him for his life. He's one of the most intelligent people in the United States, sitting in prison for decades. But they don't arrest him for his ideas. They arrest him, they say you shot a police officer. Meanwhile, down the street from him, 100 people can have small little blogs in their homes saying United States is a KKK, America spelled with KKK. They don't get arrested because nobody reads the blog. They don't have money. They can't promote the blog. So what is this freedom you talk about? You understand? Once you enter the free, unfree, you're finished. You're finished. You've accepted their terms. And then to create your own terms, you can't just do it as a hallucination. You need power. You need power. One of the grave limitations of the Soviet experiment and Eastern Europe and so on is that they were terrible at information war. They were not great at it. Because you see, in some ways, they were too ham fisted in it. They were not sophisticated. This is a problem. They would come out there and say, no, 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 you are. Front page story, the violence against people of African descent in the US South in the 1950s. Very important. Keep doing that. Look at Cuba. Santiago Alves, right, the filmmaker, Nervous Montage, his film Now, where he just takes images of violence in the United States with a, what is it, Eartha Kitt song or Lena Horne song, which is We Want Liberation Now. That was clever. That doesn't say, no, no, you are not free. It just says, this is what you are. This is what you are. I'm just putting it there. This is what you are. But you still can't define them. You still can't define them. We're still in that problem today. I don't come with a solution, Vanessa. I don't want to be like, oh, here's a better idea. No, this is a balance of forces problem. This is not a problem of how to better frame the problem. You see, they say free, unfree. So, no, no, let's do it in this cleverer way. It doesn't matter. We can, but we don't have enough power. You need to have political power behind your ideas. Otherwise, they don't become hegemonic. Merely by having better ideas doesn't make you win. Just because you have a better idea, the two of you can sit down in Brazil and have a better analysis of what's going on in Brazil, but people will still vote for Bolsonaro. Look, Bolsonaro is a genocidal maniac. Your country is in the hell of COVID, but his approval ratings still seem quite high. People still approve of him because they don't live in Rio and Sao Paulo. Maybe they live in like those districts I visited once in Brazil, which look like the US Midwest. They look like Ohio or whatever it is. They're long, flat roads with soybean fields and these Brazilian cowboys, with flat pickup trucks, and they live in like suburban enclaves, and they all happen to be sort of people of European descent, and they vote. They are Bolsonaro fans forever. Now, how to shift that? That's a class struggle. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is that our redefinition of this is a part of the class struggle. And as long as we are weaker in the class struggle, in the correlation of forces, also our ideas, and this has been there for 60 years, guys, for 60 years. That's older than me. I have lived my whole life in a position where we've been as the left, on the back foot ideologically, despite the fact that the Soviet Union was there then, Eastern Europe was a communist state system, and so on. Even then, we were on the back foot because the West has had more power over, institutions institutions that promote a certain kind of ideological clarity. We are free, you are unfree. The freedom of media index. Okay, this is smart. World Journalist Press Freedom Day was May 3rd. Which is the countries which are bad with media freedom? They'll point to which countries. They'll say but listen, what media freedom is there in the West? Because look, if you don't have money, you can't actually have an audience. So what freedom? Big newspapers, they write whatever they want, you can't argue with them. Like, they'll write a story saying that Bolsonaro is a great president, let's say. You can write a million letters to the editor, nobody's publishing it. They can write anything. So yes, you're allowed to write letters, you're allowed to put your letter up on Facebook maybe, but nobody's reading it. Your 6 family members, and you might as well just send it on your WhatsApp group, right? Family WhatsApp group. So that's the thing, with this free unfree, it's part of our struggle. So we have to be strong, we have to be patient and brave. You can't get frustrated with this. It's not just that I'm frustrated, Media Ninja is not doing a good job. It's not Media Ninja that's going to overcome this problem. It's the broad correlation of forces has to change. In 1993, I was in Caracas and we decided to go into the rainforest to hike. And we took the bus to Barquisimeto, and on the way, there's a maize factory, flour factory. We got off there and hiked into the rainforest, got lost for 3.5 days, saw no human being. Came down into the coast, and my friends went, to the beach or whatever. I was sitting in town drinking a beer, and this Santeria guy from Trinidad, comes to me and he's like, follow me, he says to me. I was like, okay. I followed him to his home, and he had a little compound in the garden. And he said, you need my whatever it is, something or the other. He was from Trinidad, so we were speaking in English. And he sat me down in the garden and he created some sort of thing, and there was marijuana and we were sitting there, and then he brings a chicken and he cuts the head off. And I was like, I'm in a dream. I don't know what's happening to me. I'm in a dream. I find Venezuela a very interesting place. Outside Caracas, there's a whole country there. And as you go towards the great oil lands of Maracaibo, that area, it's a country that has been tortured for decades. The Bolivarians only come to political power in 1998. The country has been tortured for decades before then. What people say, oh, look at Venezuela, this problem, that problem. More than half the problems are from before 1998. Like the fact that Venezuela is not food, it has no food sovereignty. This goes back to when Acción Democrática and COPE used to run the country for 40 years unchallenged,
Yeah, and even the dependence on oil, that oil was discovered in 1906, and that's a Chavez problem. Chavez didn't diversify the economy.
Chavez wasn't even born then. And nor were we. So, relax, guys. So, people forget that revolutions are created out of the context that you inherit. So even though, Lula, number one, that is when Lula first comes to office, he's coming to power after a hideous period of Brazilian history. First, you got Cardoso, who's a very credible, good economist, intellectual, whatever, but he's a right-wing guy. Governs from the right, smashes people's livelihood. Then dictatorship from 1964 onward. What did you expect to happen when Lula comes into office? Plus, he had to make a deal before he came in. Said, some things I'm not going to do because otherwise you'll throw me in jail now before I even enter. Before Allende even took office. Before he even took office in 1970, they tried to coup him. The coup of 1973 isn't the first time they tried to coup him. They killed a general of the Chilean military before Allende came to office because the general refused to coup him. These countries have a long history of hideousness. I make it a point in all the countries as much as I can to visit torture centers that have now been converted into museums. I make it a point to visit them because you have to see how wretched the history is. When you meet people and they say, "Oh, I have this problem with MST, that problem with the PT, that problem with PASOL." Relax, guys. Relax. Okay, relax, because actually Brazil has never actually had an independence movement. The country becomes independent because the father gives the son the kingdom. You got to destroy your own kind of feudalism. The racism in society has to be frontally destroyed. You can't just enter paradise like that. You have to struggle. And you have to struggle with what you've inherited, right? So these are complicated matters, not simple, they are not simple. So I get these petty disputes people have on the left. Right now, Tricontinental in May will release a dossier in mid-May. It's a fantastic text because it's a discussion with 5 leaders of Brazil's left, including Gleisi Hoffmann of the Workers' Party. And the question asked is, what is the weakness of the left? And there's a frank discussion there. The text is very good. So part 5 of 5 parts is on Lula. It's not all about Lula. There are 4 parts before then about different assessments about the broad front versus the left front. Why can't the left combine? What are the problems? Where's the weaknesses? What are the ideological, institutional weaknesses? A very good, thorough explanation. It doesn't have any answers. Why should a research institute provide answers? It merely illuminates the disputes, the debates. And I should say that these are real and good debates, but they shouldn't be done in a bad spirit. You see, if we are all people who believe in humanity, we're all on the same side of history, let's treat each other with dignity and save our anger for our enemies. What happens in the left when we are weak, when we are historically weak, like now we are historically weak, so much of our anger we direct at each other. We direct in anger, we weaken each other even more. So we are historically weak, and then we weaken each other even more because we direct our anger at each other. And the right wing is sitting there laughing. They are loving this. It's a game for them. So, how do you manage to both maintain your differences but overcome the anger? It's what I don't know how we got to this thing. I think you talked about Barquisimeto, and now we've entered into Brazilian left, and I don't know what's wrong with my brain.
No problem. I have a question about Brazil now. A poll issued today, Vijay, by the Instituto da Democracia e da Democratização da Comunicação, reveal how deep conspiratory Brazilians became in the fascist neoliberal context. Half the population believed that the virus was created by the Chinese government and that hospitals receive money to relate whatever death to COVID. 22% even think the earth is flat. That we know very well. Do you see that desperate level of conspiratory thought anywhere else? And what kind of political consequences do you think that collective hallucination might bring?
Yeah, I believe that some 40% of people in the United States, maybe 38% or something, 38% of people in the United States who are polled by reputable polling agencies say that UFOs are real, unidentified flying objects. Now, they might be real. I don't know. It's hard to say. But some half the population, or again, 39, 40% believes in the validity, actuality of the devil. Now, again, there may be a devil. I don't know. But what these examples tell us is what you're saying is that, is this a Brazil problem or a global problem? I think it's a global problem. I don't think it's a Brazil problem. I think it's a global problem there's a line that Marx has, and I have a habit of quoting Marx, and often, by the way, because I don't know any philosophy really, I'm not a well-read person in European philosophy. All my European philosophy comes through Marx because I read Marx a lot. So this may be Hegel, I don't know. Okay, it probably is Hegel, but Marx says that reason doesn't come into the world; you have to actually insert it into the world. The understanding things rationally is a process. It's not you're born, but you're not born and then you're immediately a person with great reason and evidence thinking and so on. All kinds of beliefs come. The other great European Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, he had an idea that we have contradictory consciousness. We see things from our own eyes. Like, for instance, a worker sees that my family, we work very hard, but we don't seem to make a good living, but we work hard. So we're not lazy people, right? I see it from my eyes. I'm not lazy. I work hard. I'm a good person. I don't drink excessively. I don't, this, that, and the other, but I don't make a living. Then I go to church on Sunday, and it may be a certain kind of priest there. Not all priests are like this. Certain kind of priest who says, all of you are lazy, or all of you, God has damned you because you're sinners, and that's why you're poor and you're out there, you have extramarital sex, you drugs, drink, whatever, and you're sitting there going, oh my God, I'm a sinner. So you develop what Gramsci called a contradictory consciousness. So I feel like when these polls ask people, do you believe this, do you believe that, there's a kind of way in which polls don't allow for the contradictoriness of working class consciousness. So people, for instance, may be told by Bolsonaro's son, that this is a Chinese virus, this is a Chinese virus, this is a Chinese virus. They know it's not a Chinese virus. They know that there are other viruses and no virus has a nationality. They may know that, but they also have this in their head. And a pollster asks, is this a Chinese virus, is the question. And they say, yes, it's a Chinese virus because it's in the air. So I don't actually want to make a comment saying, people are irrational, or people are this, or people are that. I actually think people are contradictory. If I didn't believe people were contradictory, then let's hang it up, fellas. Let's go back and let me pick up my guitar and sing you a song, and let's call it quits. Let's not bother with all this politics, because people are like this. Lenin Moreno the other day was criticized about his presidency, and he said, well, it may not be a problem of my presidency, it may be a problem of the Ecuadorian people. And I thought, my God, Mr. Moreno, you're so arrogant. You're so arrogant. So I actually, when I say, I don't believe that people believe in conspiracies, full stop. I think that conspiratorial thinking floats around the air. It comes from different places, and people sort of pick things up in a way that's casual. It's not like, they hear this China virus and then they sit down and say, yes, it's the China virus. I think what happens is it's floating around and people pick something up, and they pick up an idea of laziness. People are lazy, but then they know they work hard, or they pick up an idea of sin. I'm a sinner. But then they're like, I'm a sinner, but I really do like to, I enjoy sex, and oh my God, and I use contraception, and that's a sin in the eyes of the Catholic Church, but I don't want to have any more children. So I'm both, I like sex and I use it, and this is a contradictory relationship to reality. So I want us to sort of not say that, there are conspiracies, full stop, but there are these conspiratorial thoughts that exist, and we have to confront them. Part of Media Ninja, part of the work I do as a journalist, our work is to insist in a different orientation of reality, and without being arrogant towards people's various attitudes. We should not have a position of arrogance saying you're wrong, or this is stupid, or whatever. No, it's the way in which human history deals with knowledge. I mean, I came from a family, just to tell you, that none of my parents went to college. They were very intelligent people, and they had a lot of books in the house, but they were random books. There was an set of encyclopedia, then there was like some semi-pornographic novel, then there was some book that looked like some sort of pro-Nazi World War II book. I don't know where it came from, some footpath sale. Nobody read those books. My dad, when I was a certain age, used to make me read him the encyclopedia every day. So I'd have to take it down in the evening, and he'd drink his tea or he'd drink his booze, and I'd read him from the encyclopedia. Now, my parents had all kinds of odd duck ideas. When I finished college, my parents came for the graduation. Okay, they were very proud of me. Their son has graduated from college. I had a teacher there who taught me history of Asia and so on. And my father proceeded to lecture him about Japan, because my father had been to Japan many times, and, he liked Japan a lot, but he was lecturing him all kinds of crazy ideas. I was embarrassed as a young boy. I was embarrassed of my father, who I love a lot. I love my father like life itself. And I didn't like the teacher as much as I loved my father, but I was embarrassed for my father. And it took me years to understand how much I loved my father. And even in that moment, my father was right, because my father was telling the teacher, don't look at me as a fool. I know something about something. I've been to Japan. Okay. I may be saying things all wrong in your eyes, but what I'm saying is also true. What I'm saying is true because I believe it. And if I had had time to study and learn and read more, I might have developed my ideas. So I think that's what I mean when I say I look at the world when we see these kind of polls, and I think it's very unfair, because the poll is making fun of my family. It's making fun of people I love who have all kinds of odd ideas. So our attitude to that has to be, how do we take the ideas of people and elaborate it into a different set of ideas? How do we let's go and interrogate, why are people believing it's the China virus? Why are people believing it? Not how dare you believe that it's a China virus. You see, that's what I'm trying to say, is we shouldn't look to our class, to the working class peasantry, take a view. How dare you believe these crazy things? You see, how dare you fall for evangelism or Pentecostalism? How dare you do this? That should not be our attitude as media, as idea producers and so on. Our attitude should be, yes, you go for Pentecostal because you want to learn to play the guitar. And in Brazil, there is no other place to learn music except these places. And while you're there, you hear things, and some of them may attract you. Now, how do I give you something better than that, instead of me telling you you're an idiot? So that's what. Sometimes these polls are very bad. They have a class bias to them. They have a class bias. They have a class bias.
For some time now, it seems like public opinion in the United States have discovered a place in China called Xinjiang. Uyghurs have been a minority there for 9,000 years. But now there are claims of genocide and concentration camps and all this stuff that get thrown around like this, and there's no evidence whatsoever. And I'd like you to comment a bit on that. If you know what's going on there, if there is anything going on there, and what kind of evidence gets to you in the US.
So, I mean, I should say directly, I'm a fellow at an research institute in Beijing, and I have a lot of colleagues and friends in China that I work with. And when these stories began to come out, my colleague and I, Xiaorong Ji, and I began to look into the question of what was being said. He works for an organization called Maku. And we, took a deep dive. We interviewed people who are in Xinjiang, outside Xinjiang, mostly intellectuals, to be frank, because neither of us went to Urumqi or went on the ground in South Xinjiang. We talked to media people, intellectuals, and so on. So I've learned a few things. Obviously, Xinjiang province, the westernmost province of China, is 2.5 times the size of France in area. It's a very large place. So it's difficult to make Brazil is this. Yesterday, 25 people were shot in Brazil in what's being called a massacre. There's no world press about it, by the way, almost none. Now, the government says, look, the police fired in self-defense, or security forces fired in self-defense. The community say they were surrendering, in the middle of surrendering. The police say that they were selling drugs to children. I mean, who doesn't want people who sell drugs to children or sexual violators of children to be killed, right? It's an emotional response. So this is pure propaganda in that sense. We don't know what happened. Brazil is a large place. I'm sure neither of you have been on the ground there, but you understand a little of how the government works. So your suspicions go up. I mean, Gabriel already rolled his eyes when I said, they said that they were in self-defense. You rolled your eyes because you know that this is a cliche. You haven't interviewed anybody. You haven't seen footage, but you know there's a tendency. As media producers, we understand who we're dealing with, right? They have a history. They have a history, from the wars against the favelas around the Olympics. You got direct visual of how they behave. They are an occupying army and so on. I don't need to lecture you about Brazil, but the point I'm making is, we know how these things operate. And so Xinjiang, the most western province of China, has a large Uyghur population, not by any means the majority of the people, but it's the largest minority group. And so they have come in a way into three different vices of their social development, their history. The first is that the Chinese Revolution, and before that, the Republican state from 1911 onward had totally neglected all the marginal parts of China. Now, it's interesting, the marginal regions of China are where mostly the minorities live, whether it's in Kunming province in the south, it's Tibet, it's the Uyghurs and others in Xinjiang, and then the Mongo Ren people up in the Mongolian heartland. There's a lot of minorities in the borderland. This is a part of the historical development of China. The way in which Chinese history for thousands of years has developed. These minority areas are in the rim. And so when the Republic was created, and then when the Chinese Revolution took place, for decades there was total neglect of the development of the West. The Chinese Revolution developed the agricultural heartland and the rim, of China, from Beijing down to Shanghai and so on, and the agricultural heartland. But these rim areas suffered neglect. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that it turns out that in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs are mainly Muslim, and they have a link to the Turkic people of Central Asia all the way out to Turkey. So there is also a religious minority aspect to this. It's not only that they are ethnic minorities remote from the two. First thing is the ethnic minorities, and second is they are remote from Beijing and Shanghai and so on. Third thing is they happen to be a religious minority linked to Central Asia and so on. So these are three distinct features of the Uyghur population. And by the way, before the Chinese Revolution, Xinjiang was very close to the Soviet Union. It had very close ties in the Soviet Union, and the ideas of national self-determination had played a role there. They also played a role in Tibet. One of the founders of the Tibetan Communist Party, long before the Chinese Revolution, was inspired by Lenin, and the idea of national self-determination. These ideas are quite strong in the left in these parts of the world. So it's actually a story goes back about 20 to 25 years when the Chinese revolutionary process began to incorporate the margins, both Tibet and Xinjiang. Listen, I'm sorry this is going on a little long, but this is a complicated story. So the idea of the incorporation of Xinjiang, what we learned was that they had a policy called Develop the West. That was the slogan. Develop the West. A lot of capital from the eastern seaboard went into Xinjiang to develop cotton particularly, but other industries as well. They mechanized the cotton industry in southern Xinjiang. It's one of the world's biggest producers of cotton. So they mechanized that. They had a lot of machinery come from the United States, from John Deere, this company that makes tractors and so on. And then they industrialized some of the cities. This also meant the entry of so-called Han Chinese populations into Xinjiang that came with the capital. Because now I'm investing money, starting a factory in Urumqi, I'm going to send technicians. So now you're not training people necessarily from the area, you're bringing in people from the eastern seaboard. This has an impact, a social impact. So you now have a couple of things happening. You have economic development, which creates its own aspirations. and you have the arrival of so-called outsiders in coming in large numbers, the Han Chinese population coming in. This creates its own contradictions. This happens at the same time as the Soviet Union falls. Okay, it's just a perfect storm. The Soviet Union falls, and the old Islamist presence that was there in Afghanistan as a consequence of the US war against the Afghan communist government in Afghanistan from 1978-79, this includes Osama bin Laden and all these people in Afghanistan, that had a big impact in Central Asia when the Soviet Union collapsed. So when Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, when they become independent countries, these Islamist groups create insurgencies in each of them. The most powerful of the lot was the Islamic Union of Uzbekistan. Now, its leaders were crazy. They were very violent. They began to train people from Xinjiang. These people now come into camps in Afghanistan. I've seen them. I've seen Uyghur, and they don't call it Xinjiang. By the way, Xinjiang's official name is Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The word Uyghur is in the name of the province. They were coming into these camps, but they were considering themselves Eastern Tatars. That there is this Turkish nation, and they are Eastern Tatars. And they are highly motivated into the sort of Al-Qaeda ideology. It's these young people that then go to Syria to fight in the war in Syria. They go to Libya, they train in Turkey and so on. They start coming back to Urumqi, they start coming back to Xinjiang, and they start a series of terror attacks, including killing of Muslim clerics who were pro-government. This begins. So now you have a perfect storm. You have the rise of economic development. The Silk Road is going through Xinjiang. You have the Han Chinese population coming in to stay, creating some cultural and social tensions. You have the government trying to say, we want to integrate you, so children should learn Mandarin. Now, you learn Mandarin not necessarily to erase your culture, but also its economic opportunities. Let's be fair. Children all around the global south go to English school to learn. The two of you know English perfectly cleanly. Why didn't your parents say only Portuguese for you kids? We maintain no, somebody must have said, go learn English, it's better for your chances in jobs and so on. Gabriel, you work for a French company. I don't know if you speak French, but maybe you speak to them in English, or maybe in French, but you had to learn that for economic opportunities, not to erase your Brazilianness. That's silly. So all these things created tension, and it created an opening for a lot of resistance in Xinjiang against the Chinese government. And this was inflamed by the CIA, inflamed by Western intelligence and so on. And suddenly, in the middle of this contest with China, suddenly they said there's genocide in Xinjiang. So you see what happens. There are problems. Of course, there are problems. There are problems of social development. Migrants coming from outside, these create tensions. Listen, let's take Brazil, okay? People of European descent move into the Amazon, okay? They want to cut the trees down. They want to, I remember reading about, what's that great hero's name? Chico Mendes, sorry, it left my brain for a minute. Chico Mendes, these miners come and there's a tension. The tension isn't just cutting the trees down, but it's also people are coming from outside. They're taking our land and those struggles. This is a normal fight in all countries, okay? Nothing peculiar about China. There are people coming from, from say Chongqing to stay in Urumqi. It creates tensions. This happens. But who comes in and turns the key on the tension, presses the petrol, presses the gas pedal and starts to inflame the tension? Suddenly you say it's genocide and they want to kill these people. The United States government is the defender of Muslims. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. How can people believe it? But they do, because information war.
Mike Pompeo concerned about Muslims.
Mike Pompeo, who is the head of the CIA, suddenly is a defender of human rights. But you see, that's the thing, is there are problems. Of course, there are problems. China is not some extraterrestrial paradise. They have to deal with the fact that there are minorities. They have to deal with marginal areas, how to develop. You have to be sensitive to people's cultures and so on. But you see, what is sensitivity to culture? Let's come back to Brazil. Years ago, I met a Kayapo leader at a meeting in Durban in South Africa. And this is around the time there was a debate about the development of the Amazon. And this the lead, I've forgotten the name of this leader of the Kayapo people, but he was explaining to me. He said, look, we are not against our children going to school, and we want our children to learn Portuguese, and we want to have electricity, and we want to have all this stuff. We don't want to live in the forest like we are some people in a zoo. We want our lives to expand in a certain way, but we want also to maintain the dignity of our traditions, our customs, and we don't want to be wiped out. I thought it was a sensitive, good thing. So he's neither talking about like preservation of a people as if they are in a zoo, right? We don't want that, he says, and we don't want annihilation. We want a balanced development. And that, to some extent, is the struggle in Xinjiang province. How do you maintain Uyghur traditions, but at the same time not have people just remain in a kind of poverty? How do you develop? Moment you make development, you ruin culture. Okay, guys, let me ask you a question. You remember when I don't know which generation you are of people who got advanced degrees, but if you are the first generation in a family to get advanced degrees, your mind is screwed up. When you go back to visit your family on some Christmas or whatever holiday, you feel alone a little bit. You feel a little alone because you've come back from your other friends who are in university, and you're there, and your family's talking all kinds of about sports and this and that, and you've forgotten how to be with them. And you now want to talk about some book you read, some famous book by Vanessa Oliveira. You just read this great book, and wow, Vanessa has written this new book on Google and Cuba, and I can't believe it. And that's what your friends are talking about. But meanwhile, you're sitting there and they're talking about who's going to win the game tomorrow, and you're thinking, I can't believe I'm stuck here. This is the price you pay for what happens in social life, right? Marx writes about this in the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels write about how the children are snatched from their communities when they have this development. So we should, when we look at something like Xinjiang, we should understand how similar is the problem there. It's not some genocidal issue. Of course there are problems. Of course there's chauvinism of the majority community. Let's not deny it. First time I came to Brazil, I had a conversation with somebody of European descent, and they said there's no racism in Brazil. And I said, oh, really? Okay, that's fascinating. Fascinating, because there's only racism in the United States. You see, in Brazil, we have a pluralistic country. Oh, really? Oh, okay. It's pluralistic. Amazing. No, come on, let's not deny the problems. These are universal problems. This idea of hierarchies of people, patriarchy, these are there in all societies. You can't say United States is the most racist place on earth. I just don't think so at all. I don't think so at all, because I have seen the heart of many societies. And look at India, the caste system. It's wretched, it's hideous, it's unbelievable, it's unimaginable social hierarchy. Can't tell me that somehow is not as bad as racism in the US. It's hideous. So, of course, there are problems in China, but is it sufficient problem to bomb the country into smithereens?
Vijay, I'd like to ask you about Palestine before we run out the time. And so an actual genocide here, yes, takes place in the occupied territories of Palestine. A few days ago, Human Rights Watch called Israel an apartheid state for the first time. And it doesn't sound a lot like Human Rights Watch. Why do you think they choose to use that word now?
Okay, I don't want to sound like that guy, but I will, I think, sound like that guy. So firstly, Israel was founded in 1948. It was founded by at the same time as it expelled Palestinian population. The Palestinian population then went into, let's say, 3 different zones. One, a Palestinian population remained in what was the state of Israel. Let's not forget that. Secondly, there was a Palestinian population that was at the rim of Israel in what was then under Jordanian control, the West Bank of the Jordan River, Jerusalem. And then there was a section of the Palestinian population in Gaza, which was nominally between UN and Egyptian control. So that was the second lot of Palestinians. The third lot of Palestinians went into exile to the Gulf Arab countries, to Lebanon, to Brazil, to South America. There are more Palestinians, in many parts of the world now than there are in historic Palestine. That's a very important part of the Palestinian community. Okay, why am I saying this? Then in 1967, Israel annexes the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So now we only have, in a sense, two Palestinian fragments. One is Palestinians under Israeli control, and the second is Palestinians outside Israeli control. In 2013-14, the UN Economic and Social Commission, which is based in Beirut, Lebanon, under the then leadership of Rima Khalaf, released a report. The report showed that Israel is an apartheid state. The report indicated that the apartheid is not only demonstrated against people who live in the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank, of East Jerusalem and Gaza. That's one of the but the apartheid is also against Palestinians inside Israel because they don't have full rights. And it's also against Palestinians who are in exile because they don't have a right to return. This is a very important point. So I'm going to try to make it slowly. That was the ESQA report. It said the apartheid is against all three of the Palestinian communities. The Palestinian community inside 1948 Israel, the Palestinian communities in the occupied Palestinian territories, and the Palestinians who are in exile. All three Palestinian communities experience Israeli apartheid by policy, not by emotion, because the right to return means that the Palestinians in exile don't have the right to be full citizens. They experience apartheid. It's a very important distinction here, because then a report produced in 2017 by ESQA, this UN Economic and Social Commission of West Asia, authored by two people, Richard Falk and I've forgotten her name. She's a professor in the United States. Anyway, the two of them authored a report in 2017, which essentially validated the ESQA big report in 2013. They said Israel is an apartheid state, but against all three of the constituent parts of Palestine. Human Rights Watch report very importantly uses the word apartheid, but only to describe the Palestinians in the West Bank, not exactly East Jerusalem and Gaza. So it suggests that the Palestinians who are under occupation experience apartheid, and to some extent Palestinians inside Israel, because they don't have full rights. But it does not mention the bulk of the Palestinians who live in exile. It does not mention the right to return as a form of apartheid. So I'm happy that they have advanced. Remember, I said I don't want to be that guy who says, well, it's limited and so on. I'm happy that they have advanced to use the word apartheid. It's very, very important, significant development that Human Rights Watch has advanced to use the term, because reality has forced them to it, okay? Even though they are so close to the US State Department, reality has forced them to use the word apartheid to refer to Palestinians inside Palestine, the 48 lines, Palestinians who are in occupation, West Bank and Gaza. East Jerusalem, Israel is wiping it out. As we talk in Sheikh Jarrah, they went into Al-Aqsa Mosque today. I mean, it's horrendous. That force is horrendous. But there's no mention of the exiled Palestinians, the bulk of the population. And that's a form of apartheid, because they don't have the right to return to their own homeland. You see, they don't have a right to return. That's a form of apartheid. So it's a great advance. I celebrate it. But I also want to hesitate to say this is where we should stop. Remember when Chavez went to the UN and he said, there's a smell of sulfur here. Chavez went for us, Chavez stood there, there's a smell of sulfur. Nikita Khrushchev, I don't have great things to say about Nikita Khrushchev, but this is a peasant's son. He went into the UN, took his shoe out and banged it on the table and was talking and banging his shoe, probably like his grandfather was some Russian peasant, bang, bang, bang. You know, Stalin, whatever people opinion they have of Stalin, Stalin's mother was a domestic worker. Stalin's father was a field laborer. These are people of the soil, man. I mean, they are of a different caliber. Who is Bolsonaro's pop? Bolsonaro was probably raised in Italian suits. These are people of the soil. Whatever. Chavez in Allo Presidente. He knew how to talk to cows. There's an episode of Allo Presidente. He's sitting at a table in a rural area, and some cows come in the picture, and he calls the cow over. The cow comes. He hugs the cow. He's not doing it for drama. The guy this is his life. There's a guy we had in India. He was the chief minister of Bihar, Lalu Prasad Yadav. He used to call the press in. He used to milk his cow while he was giving interviews. He was a showman. It was a setup. But still, the fellow knew how to milk a cow. Okay. Imagine that. The fellow knew how to milk a cow, right? You take the case of Joe Biden, US president, give him a cow, say, milk it. I don't think he'll know what to do, man. Like, what do I do? Exactly.
Do you think Narendra Modi can milk a cow?
Not a chance. Not now. Now he wears silk suits and so on, But even people like Biden, when I say you are saying they'll slaughter the cow, I don't think they know how. Actually, I don't even think they know how to cook, Vanessa. They know how to eat. They don't know how to do. They don't know how to produce. They are not part of the producer class. They are part of the consumption class. So we want more leaders who come from the producer class. People who know how to do things, who can work, and that's what we want to see more, not people who've spent their life spending more of their time in consumption than in production. Let's see more of people from the soil coming up and doing things, people who can do. And I don't want to be crude about this, Of course, Pedro Castillo is a teacher. It's not like he's worked in a factory or anything. But see the difference between, somebody like Lula, who's had a history of struggle, a history of work, a history of being with the people. See the difference between somebody like Lula, and then Keir Starmer, the leader of the so-called British Labour Party. So different. I mean, just the attitude to the world, the understanding of suffering. Why is it that for all the criticisms people have of Lula, why is it that he made abolishment of hunger the central feature of his administration, and sending working class children, non-European descent children to university? Why did he make that a important part? He didn't do a million things, but guys, Fome zero. I will not live in a country with a person who is hungry. I agree 100%. That's the first thing. Secondly, I want to create universities so that children who don't come from European descent families can get advanced degrees. Whatever people say about Lula, I say these two things. I agree. All the criticisms are probably correct, but these two things, if you are a family that understands hunger, what's the name of that great Brazilian writer from the 1960s, a black woman who wrote a book about hunger in Brazil? Classic book. I read it years ago.
O Quarto de Despejo. O Quarto de Despejo.
That's it. Yeah. That book, it's a philosophical book. I wish people read it in large numbers. It's a philosophical book about what it means to live as a hungry person. Hunger has to be abolished, first thing. Secondly, why shouldn't children of all backgrounds get advanced degrees? These are clear-sighted policies. I want to say one last thing, and then I know I'll leave you. But in Kerala, where the left just was re-elected to the state government, there's a policy I want to talk about for a few minutes, because I want to tell you what this whole thing about the left needing humanity is all about. This is a communist government which has had lots of calamities to deal with: cyclone, floods, viruses, and so on. A few years ago, the education ministry looked at the statistics and found that girls were not coming to school in large enough numbers. Something was happening. There was a drop off in girls' education. This is of concern, to any government, by the way. You don't have to be a communist government to be concerned that there's a drop off in education in girls. But they were concerned. And they investigated, why is this so? And what they found, there are many reasons, obviously, right? Many, but one of the things that they found that they could fix was that, of course, girls at a certain age start to menstruate. They start to have their menstruation, they bleed for a period and so on. And so they stopped coming to school during their period, what is known as the period of menstruation. So the government said, well, why are they not coming to school? Well, because particularly working class and lower middle class girls don't have access to technology. The parents are not buying pads and so on. They just use cloth. They tear old shirts and wear it. They don't have good absorbent pads. And so if you're just wearing cloth and come to school and it leaks, it's very embarrassing, And so girls just didn't come because they don't want to be humiliated like that. So what the government did, the communist government did, was they said in all schools, in bathrooms, we'll provide free technologies for girls. So that if a girl is menstruating, she can just go to the bathroom, take a pad, put it on, come back to class. Attendance rose. That is communist policy. You see, eradicating hunger, but also allowing people technology so that they can do things with dignity. That's communist policy. The small details, the big questions. You got to do it all, got to do it all. You can't say this is just gender something, or this is just race something. You got to concentrate on class or the big things. That's nonsense. Left government has to tackle all indignities. The point of a left government is to eradicate indignity as much as possible. We don't want to live without dignity. Why do we feel so strongly about things like caste or race or gender or sexuality, these issues? Not because we want to divide the working class, but because we want to have nobody feel small. That's the main thing. We want everybody to feel as powerful as they want to feel. It's not to divide the working class. Identity politics divides the working class. Communist politics makes everybody have the sense of dignity. To my mind, that's the difference. I don't believe that there should be a black organization that separates itself from everybody, or a women's organization. I believe that there should be black organization to give people confidence, but it must always work together in a project to overcome the combined indignity. Always, the book Black Power, written by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton, they had a nice line in that book. They said, we come together in order eventually to work, all of us. We separate out in order for us eventually to work together. The point isn't for permanent separation. The point is to learn to build a big movement where people have confidence. Why do I think it's okay to have a women's caucus in a left party? Because otherwise, if it's a male-female mixed group, young women, when they come in, don't have the confidence and are not allowed to speak sometimes. And so then you have this where people learn to speak and they get confidence and they come back and they say, shut up, it's my turn. So that's it. If the government doesn't pay attention to indignity of everybody, you don't build the confidence of people to participate in your movements and so on. And then people will separate and you'll create the allowance for the fracturing of the left. You got to go ahead of that, So I don't even know where this question started from, but here's the answer.
We got two last questions that we pose everybody. One of them is, what's internationalism? And the last one, Vanessa is going to make.
The name of this show is Fronteiras, which means borders. And we need to know what borders means to you.
I'm glad we put these two together because then I can answer them together, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Related questions. Yeah, very good questions. The first thing is that internationalism isn't something we want. It's not actually something I aspire to. It's imposed on us. So capitalism is a world system. Nowhere in the world does anybody live unattached to other people in different parts of the world. If you live in Brazil and you're producing soya beans, you are linked to a Chinese farmer, who is then linked to a German grocery store owner, who is then linked to a Turkish migrant who works for a Indian software company, and so on and so forth. Capitalism has socialized production. It has internationalized production. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels say that capitalist relations will break the Chinese wall of national boundaries and so on. It's true. It's true. I mean, look at us, how we are talking. This platform, well, this is, I guess, Google, but we had been talking on Zoom, which is developed by a Chinese American person, and blah blah blah. Our itineraries are incredible. In that sense, how can you not be thinking internationally? Because the objective structure of our lives is already international. Our struggles have to be international. The objective fact, for instance, the security services in Brazil, they have a link to US security companies. Probably some Israeli thing is there because Israel sends really good technologies for crowd control and so on. There's probably all kinds of. So what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah is linked to what happened in Brazil, this massacre. These things are automatically linked. You don't have to think about it. They are linked structurally. They are linked objectively. So actually, internationalism sits here in front of us. Our problem is our movements are not internationalist. The structure is international, but the subjective section, our sense of creating international is not there. So we keep struggling to create international platforms. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was an attempt with the World Social Forum. Very good attempt in Porto Alegre and so on. I was there at some social forums, fascinating, but it became a problem because 50% of the participants came from the United States. A lot of NGOs and foundations were funding it. Attack France was beginning to drive the agenda. Others just felt like we were having this internationalism imposed on us from North America and from Europe. This didn't feel authentic. Even the Brazilian element in it was not strong. Yes, it was taking place in Porto Alegre, but it seemed the agenda was set in France. At least I felt so. We all agreed against the Iraq war, but I didn't feel like they were capturing, like they were against all kinds of scientific interventions in agriculture. That doesn't work in many parts of the world because there are difference between transgenics and scientific intervention in agriculture. What's wrong with certain scientific interventions? We want to improve things so we don't have to use chemical fertilizer, chemical pesticide. So then you can engineer the things you're growing to prevent. I mean, there's a debate to be had here at any rate. They would not allow a debate. We are against this. Okay, fine, but in other parts of the world, you can't say we are against coal, for instance, coal usage. How can you be against coal? What are you saying, that children in India should not be allowed to have electricity? Are you saying that? In the pandemic now, people are complaining, I'm stuck in my house, I have to do my children's education. I sympathize with you. It's difficult. It's very difficult, this pandemic. But in many places, there's no internet in their houses. So children have not been, 700 million children or something haven't been in school. Forget no internet. In many houses, no electricity. So what are you talking about? Children in school, and they are not able, they are just sitting around doing nothing. They are ending up sitting in the porch, stealing cigarettes from their parents, smoking ganja, all this stuff. They're not studying anything for 1 year, 2 years. So you're saying no coal. That means no electricity possibility. That means certainly no internet, So let's have a discussion. It was imposed. So it's a struggle. Now I am involved, and Tricontinental emerges out of a process called International People's Assembly, which came out of a meeting held at the ENFF, north of Sao Paulo, in 2015. a very, very good process. 200 political organizations from around the world, including, of course, the MST at the center of it. These organizations come from 100 countries. It's another process. So internationalism is very difficult to build subjectively as a political project. It's not easy. You have to trust people. How do you get a set of an organization like Democratic Way in Morocco to build trust with the MST in Brazil? Don't speak the same language, have a completely different political tradition, live across the ocean. How do you do it? It's not you can't just say internationalism and then have a meeting in Berlin with 5 people who come there thanks to the Rosa Luxemburg, paying their ticket. That's not internationalism. That's 5 intellectuals who the Rosa Luxemburg picked to come for a meeting to talk about internationalism. That's okay. You must do that. I celebrate that. Do it. Have the meeting. But let's not mistake that for the building of the trust between movements. So this project, the International People's Assembly, is a movement-driven internationalism. It's not the internationalism of festivals, because the World Social Forum became a kind of festival. This is movements. To join the International People Assembly, you have to be in a movement. You can't join as an individual. You can't just come to a meeting as an individual. You have to come through a movement, and then the movement has a process to know who to send and so on. So that's what I believe in terms of internationalism, guys. Borders are interesting because borders play a couple of roles. One is capitalism has transcended borders to a great extent, but not totally. Most economic interaction happens still within a territory, depending on the size of the territory. Like Brazil is like a continent. I think probably the majority of economic interaction happens inside Brazil. Most of the GDP is constructed from within. Trade is a part of it, but not huge. Other country trade will be much bigger. If you take a small island country, trade will be a much bigger part of the GDP and so on. So it depends on that. But borders play a role even in capitalism. You can have certain rules and regulations. So they play a role, but they certainly play a role to restrict the movement of ordinary people. That's the real role they play. They enable, and I'll say a thing about wages in a second, but they play a role stopping people from moving. There is freedom of movement of capital, but not freedom of movement of labor. Capital is internationalist, but labor is not allowed to be internationalist. Labor is still stuck within national containers, regional containers, and so on. Now, wages. This is a huge advantage to capitalism because, you see, capitalism is able to make super profits from this belt of countries where wages are held below the global minimum. There's no global minimum wage. A worker in, let's say, Europe or the United States makes a lot more money than a worker in Brazil or in India or places like that. Why are the wages suppressed in these parts of the world? It's not because the standard of living is suppressed. It's because their standard of life is suppressed. In other words, an Indian worker is not assumed to be able to have internet in their house, not assumed to have leisure time. We don't say that person deserves to have a flat screen TV and so on. We say at most let them have a radio in their house. So forget that. One person in the building will have a TV they can all see there. Their standard of life is suppressed, which then allows the standard of living to be suppressed, which allows wages to be held down. This is the class struggle in an international level. So yes, we are internationalists, but we also have to fight to, in a sense, settle accounts with our national bourgeoisie. We have to settle accounts. So the Brazilian working class has to be internationalist, but it has to also settle accounts with its own bourgeoisie. It can't just become internationalist. You can't just fight internationally. That's ridiculous. You have to fight first where you work, your region, your government. You have to, in Brazil, overthrow the oligarchy that governs that country. You have to fully overthrow it. The Lula-Dilma period was not a period of overthrowing the oligarchy. It was attempting to move a left agenda within the structures of oligarchical Brazilian capitalism. In fact, in Venezuela, the oligarchy hasn't been overthrown. It remains intact in Venezuela. There's a private sector still there. It's a socialist government. in a capitalist oligarchical system. They haven't, it's not a socialist country. That's, people who say that are crazy. It's still, the capitalist class still exists. I met a man, an opposition politician, whose family makes money selling swimming pools. This is now in Venezuela. They make swimming pools in people's homes because the capitalist class still exists there. It's not, it's a socialist government in a capitalist country. Lula ran and Dilma ran a socialist government or socialistic government in a capitalist country, in oligarchical, worst kind of capitalism, oligarchical crony capitalism. Look at the scandals when they come out. So borders play a role. They are positive and negative. They're negative because they prevent labor from going in and out. They're positive because you can actually drive a political agenda somewhere on earth. Somewhere you can control the constitution and laws of a country. So you can have power. If it was the whole planet, my God, it would be too hard to make a revolution. So, good luck, guys. Good luck. Fora Bolsonaro, number one. And secondly, not just Fora Bolsonaro, because you can Fora Bolsonaro and bring in the center right. So you don't just want Fora Bolsonaro, you want to advance to socialism. It's not just Fora Bolsonaro. I agree. That's a good slogan. But Fora Bolsonaro plus advance to socialism. Because you don't want the center right to come back. You've already had Cardoso. You don't want to go back to that nightmare, of Cardoso. Cardoso part 2. No.